I'll recognize the member for Calgary Elbow.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on one of my favourite topics. One of the first things that we had the opportunity to do in this Assembly very shortly after the 2015 election was participate in the Select Special Ethics and Accountability Committee, an all-party committee tasked with reviewing all aspects of Alberta's campaign finance laws, our Elections Act, the Conflicts of Interest Act. There was many different aspects of that committee. Now, it was a committee that was given 1 year in its mandate, and we sadly didn't get very far, unfortunately, before the committee was allowed to run its course. And what is so profoundly disappointing to me is that committee is precisely where we should be having these sorts of discussions. The objective of a committee like that, an all-party committee of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, should be to provide thoughtful consideration to all aspects of the legislation that is before that committee. And one of the reasons that we send that sort of legislation to those sorts of committees is that they have the time to consider all of the possible consequences one way or the other, intended and otherwise. We bring in experts, we listen to the Chief Electoral Officer, we listen to the Ethics Commissioner, we solicit input from the people of Alberta in terms of how they would like to see the election laws in this province changed and updated. And let me be very clear, after 43 and a half years of PC rule, it was long overdue to update those election laws. I don't think actually anyone in this chamber would disagree with that fact. They'd become out of date. They biased large organizations, allowed donation limits far in excess of what I think most Albertans would have considered reasonable. So these are things that we were grappling with. But when we make those changes, changes have consequences. And sometimes those consequences are intended and stated and clear. Sometimes those consequences are accidental and unintended. Sometimes those consequences are very intended, but kind of hidden, secreted away. And perhaps sometimes when changes are made, those changes are made for reasons that a particular governing party may think is in their best interest. That, I think, is what's happened in this case. The government used their majority on the Select Special Ethics and Accountability Committee to stack the deck in their favour, or tried to do so. They tried to do that. They tried to do that, and I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that members on the opposition side, all of us, the member for Calgary Mountain View, the members from what is now the UCP, and myself, although we didn't agree on every single aspect of the changes that we would have preferred to see, we tried our utmost to hold the government back and say, the changes you're making, while you might think they're in your best interest in doing so, there are some real risks to the changes you're making. And that, Mr. Speaker, is why we're here debating Bill 32. Bill 32 is a voluminous, large, wide-ranging, enormous, and very big attempt to fix the unintended consequences. What it is trying to do, this government, in restricting political activity in the way they did, created a monster. That monster is called PACs, or colloquially third-party advertisers, according to the Act. We now need, having created a monster, we need to try to put that genie back in the bottle because these guys couldn't get their ducks in a row. And I can't think of any other analogies, maybe put lightning back in the bucket, whatever, I don't know, whatever it is. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is that when these changes are made, they create knock-on effects and wide-ranging knock-on consequences. And so that's allowed PACs to spring up, and what we refer to as dark money. Albertans know that's wrong. The challenge is, in a free and democratic society, it's very difficult for a government to restrain or to constrict or limit an Albertan's ability to freely express themselves or freely associate with other people. And so now here we are trying to put this genie back in the bottle, and it's a really difficult thing to do now that they've been created. I do have some concerns about this bill, whether in fact the limits on spending third-party advertisers dating back to December 1st, before the fixed election period, is in fact going to withstand a court challenge. I hope it does. I think it's not an unreasonable attempt to restrict third-party advertising leading into an election period, but it may not succeed given past precedent. What is so troubling, Mr. Speaker, is as we learn, the Chief Electoral Officer, having written to the Minister of Democratic Renewal, expressing his grave concerns about some aspects of this bill. And what I am troubled to learn, Mr. Speaker, is that the Chief Electoral Officer was not actively consulted through the creation of Bill 32. And I think one of the reasons we can see that that may be is this government rushed to put some changes in place. One of the ways that we know, a little hint as to how we know that this bill was so rushed, was that this bill was printed out on 8.5 by 11 paper. It was whacked together at the last minute. Bill 30, on the other hand, is printed in the proper bill format, so we know that that's work that's been ongoing for a long time. We have some concerns with that. We can deal with that when debating Bill 30. But Bill 32 was put together hastily. And in being put together hastily, the government either didn't have the opportunity or chose not to consult with the very people, the very organization that will be required to actually implement these proposed changes. So we're here debating the referral motion for Bill 32. And while I feel strongly that this government should have taken the opportunity, should have availed itself of the opportunity it had through the Select Special Ethics and Accountability Committee, which had very capable members from all sides of the House on that committee, willing and able to work very hard to think through the potential changes, to really work that through. This government had a generational opportunity to make lasting change that would positively impact democracy in Alberta by saying we're not just going to make changes that are in the benefit of the New Democratic Party. We're not going to make changes that we think is going to undercut other parties. No, we're going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. This change, these changes, this bill that they brought forward to make the changes that we find ourselves now, had the opportunity for them to say, this isn't about us. This will stand the test of time. These changes are going to serve Albertans and defy the opposition to vote against it, because the opposition would have been a part of actually making those changes. And those of us on this side, although we may not have agreed on absolutely everything, if we had seen this government taking thoughtful time to actually make meaningful change that was in the best interest truly of the people of Alberta, truly of democracy, we would have voted enthusiastically in favor of those changes. And this government would have deserved the praise it received for doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, but they didn't do that. They decided to stack the deck and put rules in place they thought were to their benefit. What they did is they created a monster called PACs. We have these millions of dollars flowing into Jason Kenney's PACs and UCP PACs, and there's even Alberta Together, this Alberta Together group, which has no formal affiliation with the Alberta Party. I don't want Alberta Together to exist. I don't think it should have to exist. I think Albertans know what political parties are. I think the Alberta Party should attract donations from Albertans. We should report those donations publicly. Our job is to elect MLAs. Our job is to form the next government. Albertans understand what that is. That's our job. We shouldn't have to have these shadow organizations. I don't like that they exist. I want nothing to do with it. I think the UCP and Jason Kenney and all of that group should also feel like those things shouldn't have to exist either. All the organizations that support the NDP also shouldn't have to exist either. Political activity should exist within the political system as governed very strictly and appropriately by Elections Alberta. But here we are. So we have a bill before us, and we have a referral motion which we're debating with whether or not this should be referred to committee. And much as I think that we should take some time and should have taken the time back a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, to really thoughtfully go through Alberta's election laws, we have to bring this bill to fruition in this session, because there's changes that exist in this bill, especially as it relates to third-party advertisers and PACs, which will at least constrain those activities somewhat. It fixes things, sort of. Now, we're spending a lot of time here at second reading on many different bills, this bill included, and I can assure you that we intend to bring forward some amendments to Bill 32. I would encourage other members to do the same, because there's a lot that needs to be improved here. Again, the Chief Electoral Officer has brought forward a number of points in, I understand, in some correspondence with the Minister very recently. about specifically as it relates to advanced polling and a number of other things. He's used the words unintended consequences. And I just want to reflect on that briefly, that where an officer of the Legislative Assembly is using words like unintended consequences, they don't do this lightly. Their job is not to pick sides. They're the least partisan organization in this entire province. Their commitment is to democracy. They care about free and fair elections. They care about a fair process. That's all they care about. And so to hear those sorts of comments while a bill is before the legislature is actually quite remarkable. It is actually quite remarkable. And so I look forward to digging a little deeper into that. I just want to identify a couple of areas where I think that once we get this bill out of the referral and finally through second and into committee, that I think we need to tackle. I'd like to see a definition of PAC. What exactly is a political action committee in the eyes of Elections Alberta? I understand that that third-party advertiser is a thing defined by the Act, but I think those organizations that exist only to foster political activity should also be defined as distinct from political action committees. Let's define even further what PACs can do and not do as it relates to political parties. There's an effort to address that in this bill by saying the PACs cannot sell memberships, cannot fundraise, cannot do those sorts of things. I get that. Another area that we talked a great deal about in the Select Special Ethics and Accountability Committee, and one of the reasons that I find myself as MLA for Calgary-Elbow, I firmly believe, is the very necessary step to restrict government advertising during by-elections and general elections. I'm sure you will all recall the story in the 2014 by-election of announcements of school portables being made in my constituency by the then government, which actually happened in two different schools in Calgary-Elbow. Funny, the one that seemed to get all the news attention was the school that my kids went to, interestingly enough. That was quite an experience. That was quite an entree into politics, I can assure you. But ultimately, interestingly, it didn't work, actually. The polls around the school where most parents sent their kids to that school actually voted more for me than they voted for the Minister of Education at the time, interestingly enough. So even then it didn't work. Ultimately, here I am, and he's not. But government advertising, you know, one of the things that we need to think about is while a by-election is on, this bill would restrict what the government can announce specific to a constituency. Fair. I think that is certainly a very good idea. But it doesn't restrict broadly enough, I don't think, what governments can advertise outside of the constituency. For example, as we look at the Calgary-Lougheed by-election, the government has not made any specific announcements relating to what might be happening in Lougheed, but there has been some talk about the Cancer Centre, for example, and those sorts of things that would perhaps seek to influence how the voters of that constituency, notwithstanding the fact that it may not be directly in that constituency. So I'd like to see some more restrictions on that. Spending limits, as I talked about earlier, around election period may in fact be problematic as it relates to the courts. And again, the government's created this monster which is tough to deal with. One way to help deal with that, I would suggest, is a fixed election date, not a range of dates. I think that will help. I suspect the courts would look at the potential range of December 1st of the year prior to the fixed election period. We could be having an election as late as May or June, according to the fixed election period. I suspect the courts may say that that 6-month window is probably too long. I would like some clarity on whether out-of-province donations are in fact banned for third-party advertisers, how exactly that may work. So in the end, I don't actually support the referral motion. I will vote against that, but I will in fact, because I feel that the changes that this bill brings forward, the opportunity for us to bring further changes and amendments in the committee stage, should we find ourselves ever actually at committee stage on this bill or any other bill that's currently before the legislature, should that day eventually come, there is some opportunity here, I think, to make some very substantive and substantial improvements to this bill. We certainly intend to bring some amendments forward, and I suspect and wonder if perhaps the government would also consider the same, given the feedback from the Chief Electoral Officer. But I don't feel it's appropriate at this stage to kick the can even further down the road. And I do wonder what the agenda of the UCP is in bringing the referral motion. Perhaps they would like to continue benefiting from the many PACs that back both their leader as well as their party. And I don't think that I have any more time, so I'll sit down.
Under 29(2)A, the